The Nexus station floated in the void like a chrome-plated testament to galactic cooperation, which was really just a fancy way of saying organized chaos with better air filtration. Here, in the glittering heart of civilized space, representatives from 100 different worlds gathered to prove that yes, the universe really could get along, provided everyone agreed that the Velthari were naturally superior, the Korthek were born warriors, and humans were adorable little death monkeys who somehow hadn't managed to blow themselves up yet. The station's designers had clearly majored in impressive architecture, with a minor in compensating for something. Every corridor gleamed with polished metal, every viewport offered a stunning view of the cosmos, and every public space featured at least 3 different species arguing about trade routes while pretending they weren't sizing each other up for potential conquest. It was diplomacy at its finest, really. All the posturing of warfare with significantly better catering. In the recreational wing, where beings came to unwind from the exhausting business of not starting interstellar incidents, the combat arena hummed with activity. Because nothing said relaxation quite like watching sentient creatures pummel each other in the name of friendly competition. The arena itself was a marvel of engineering, equipped with energy shields, medical scanners, and enough safety protocols to satisfy even the most paranoid insurance adjuster. These precautions were, naturally, designed with the assumption that combatants would possess something resembling common sense. This assumption was about to be tested. Zeth'kar of the 5th Crystalline House lounged in the observation deck like a living sculpture of arrogance wrapped in chitinous armor. His species, the Velthari, had perfected the art of looking down on others both literally and figuratively, a neat trick when you stood nearly 8 feet tall and your exoskeleton reflected light in patterns that screamed "I'm better than you" in 17 different languages. The crystals embedded in his carapace pulsed with a soft blue glow, each pulse timed to his heartbeat, which meant observers could actually watch his excitement build as he spotted his target. That target was currently seated cross-legged on a bench, reading what appeared to be a textbook on quantum mechanics, while casually consuming what the station's food dispensers optimistically labeled pizza. Kai Chen looked, by galactic standards, like evolution's practical joke, a bipedal primate with soft skin, no natural armor, and the apparent structural integrity of wet cardboard. She was small even by human standards, barely reaching most aliens' shoulder height, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and clothes that suggested she'd raided a utility closet rather than a fashion boutique. The irony, of course, was that Kai hailed from Earth, a planet whose very name made seasoned space marines check their weapons and whisper prayers to whatever deities specialized in "please don't let the Deathworlders notice me." But looking at her now, peacefully reading while cheese dripped from her slice of processed food product, one could be forgiven for thinking the galaxy's reputation system needed a serious software update. Zeth'kar, however, saw only what his prejudices allowed him to see, a fragile little creature from a backward world, sitting alone because no one else wanted to associate with primitive stock. The fact that other species gave her a respectful birth registered in his mind as fear of contamination rather than cautious wisdom. After all, what could possibly be threatening about something that looked like it might blow away in a strong solar wind? "Look at that," he announced to his entourage of similarly enlightened beings, his voice carrying the particular tone that suggested he was about to say something profoundly stupid and was quite proud of it. The Deathworld primitive, sitting there pretending to understand higher mathematics. How wonderfully quaint. His companions, a mix of species that had collectively never met a stereotype they couldn't embrace, chuckled appreciatively. There was Gorvek, a Thraxian whose idea of intellectual discourse involved comparing the destructive capacity of various plasma weapons, and Yelena, a Zalati whose crystalline features constantly shifted between expressions of boredom and mild disdain. Together, they formed the sort of group that made diversity look like a punishment rather than a strength. "Perhaps she's studying how to count past 10 without removing her shoes," suggested Gorvek, apparently under the impression that this observation qualified as wit rather than a demonstration of his own intellectual limitations. Kai's eyes flicked up from her textbook for just a moment, taking in the group with the sort of calm assessment usually reserved for mildly interesting scientific specimens. Then she returned to her reading, turning a page with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to ignore background noise. This dismissal, delivered without a word or even a change in expression, struck Zeth'kar's ego like a meteorite hitting atmosphere, spectacular, destructive, and visible from orbit. "Did you see that?" he hissed to his companions, his crystalline plates flaring brighter with indignation. The creature actually dismissed me. Me. As if a primitive from a backwater rock could possibly comprehend its betters. The truth, as truth often did, chose this moment to be particularly inconvenient. Kai Chen held 3 degrees in applied physics, spoke 7 languages fluently, and had spent her childhood learning what her species cheerfully called basic survival skills on a planet where the weather could kill you, the plants could kill you, and the plants that couldn't kill you were probably just saving their energy for when you let your guard down. But prejudice, like stupidity, was remarkably resistant to facts. Perhaps, Zeth'kar announced, rising from his seat with the theatrical flair of someone who had clearly practiced this moment in front of a mirror, our Deathworld friend would benefit from a practical demonstration of the natural order. I challenge her to combat in the arena. The casual conversation in the observation deck died like a communications array in an ion storm. Beings who had been discussing trade agreements and cultural exchanges suddenly found themselves witnesses to what was either about to be the galaxy's most educational moment or its most tragic mistake. Given the betting odds that immediately began circulating through private comm channels, most observers were leaning toward educational. Kai looked up from her textbook again, this time with what might charitably be called interest. She studied Zeth'kar with the same attention she had been giving her quantum mechanics equations, as if calculating variables and determining outcomes. Then, impossibly, she smiled. "Sure," she said, closing her book with a soft thud that somehow managed to sound ominous. "Sounds fun." The arena's preparation protocols kicked in with the efficiency of a system designed by beings who understood that friendly competition could easily become interstellar incident with casualties. Force fields hummed to life, medical scanners calibrated themselves for multiple species physiologies, and emergency response teams took their positions with the weary professionalism of people who had seen this exact scenario play out before. Zeth'kar entered the combat zone like a gladiator returning to familiar ground, his movements fluid and confident. His species had evolved on a high-gravity world where strength meant survival, and millennia of natural selection had crafted them into living weapons. His exoskeleton could deflect small arms fire, his strength could crush steel, and his reflexes were fast enough to snatch flying insects from the air. By any reasonable measurement, he was a formidable opponent. Kai entered the arena like someone walking to class, carrying her textbook and still chewing the last bite of her pizza. She wore standard station attire, a simple jumpsuit designed for comfort rather than protection, and her only preparation consisted of setting her book carefully on a bench and stretching her shoulders with the casual efficiency of someone working out a kink from too much studying. The crowd had swelled to include representatives from dozens of species, all drawn by the peculiar fascination of watching a potential disaster unfold in real time. The betting pools had grown exponentially, with odds heavily favoring Zeth'kar, not because anyone particularly liked him, but because basic physics seemed to suggest that 8 feet of armored muscle would triumph over 5.5 feet of what appeared to be concentrated fragility. "This is almost too easy," Zeth'kar announced, flexing his primary combat arms in a display that was presumably meant to be intimidating. "I'll try to make it quick, little primitive. No sense prolonging the inevitable." Kai nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the logistics of his promise. "That's very considerate of you," she replied, her tone suggesting she was genuinely touched by his concern for her welfare. "I'll try to do the same." The combat began with Zeth'kar's opening gambit, a straightforward charge designed to overwhelm his opponent through superior mass and momentum. It was a textbook move, the sort of thing that worked beautifully against opponents who relied on similar tactics. Against a human who had grown up on a world where everything wanted to kill you, it was roughly equivalent to announcing your intentions via formal invitation. Kai sidestepped the charge with minimal effort, her movement so economical it barely qualified as dodging. Zeth'kar, committed to his attack, sailed past her and crashed into the arena's rear wall with a sound like a dropped chandelier. He recovered quickly. His species were nothing if not resilient, and spun around with a snarl that suggested his earlier confidence was undergoing rapid modification. "Hold still, you scurrying pest," he roared, launching into a series of strikes that would have reduced most opponents to component atoms. Kai, however, was not most opponents. She flowed around his attacks like water finding the spaces between stones, never quite where his claws expected her to be. Her movements were precise, efficient, and completely lacking in wasted motion. She wasn't showing off or playing to the crowd. She was simply staying out of the way, while her opponent wore himself down against empty air. To the observers, it looked like a textbook case of superior skill overcoming brute force. To Kai, it was Tuesday afternoon combat practice, the sort of thing she had been doing since she could walk. Her instructors back on Earth had been very clear about the principles involved. Let your opponent commit to attacks. Stay mobile. Wait for the opening. Then end it quickly and decisively. The opening came when Zeth'kar, frustrated by his inability to land a solid hit, attempted a devastating overhead strike designed to crater the arena floor. It was powerful, dramatic, and left him momentarily off balance as his claws embedded themselves in the supposedly indestructible combat surface. Kai moved then, finally transitioning from defense to offense with a sort of fluid precision that made physics weep with joy. She stepped inside his guard, placed one small hand against his crystalline chest plate, and delivered what her instructors had always called a love tap, a strike that channeled the full power of human biomechanics through the specific point where Zeth'kar anatomy was most vulnerable. The sound was unlike anything the arena's acoustical systems were designed to handle. It started as a sharp crack, like breaking crystal, then expanded into a wet crunch that suggested something important had just stopped working correctly. Zeth'kar's eyes went wide with shock, then pain, then the peculiar expression of someone whose worldview was undergoing catastrophic revision. He collapsed. The medical teams, who had been standing by for exactly this sort of educational moment, rushed onto the combat floor with practiced efficiency. Their scanners immediately began cataloging the damage. 3 fractured ribs, 1 completely shattered, internal bleeding, and what appeared to be a severely bruised ego. The ribs, ironically, were made of the same crystalline material that comprised his supposedly impenetrable armor. Kai stepped back and watched the medical response with a detached interest of someone observing a particularly effective scientific demonstration. When the lead medic looked up at her, with something approaching awe, she shrugged. Basic human anatomy, she explained, her tone suggesting she was discussing the weather rather than the casual dismantling of a supposedly superior being. Humans evolved to throw things accurately. Rocks, spears, punches, same basic principle. You generate force through your entire kinetic chain, then focus it through a single point of contact. It's really quite simple once you understand the physics involved. The medic, a being whose species had never evolved past using tools that didn't require precision, nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense. It didn't, of course, but admitting ignorance in front of a human was apparently more terrifying than pretending to understand concepts that violated everything he thought he knew about biology. The crowd, meanwhile, was undergoing its own educational experience. The sudden silence that had greeted Zeth'kar's collapse was giving way to animated discussions about human physiology, Deathworld evolution, and the apparently significant gap between reputation and reality. Several beings were frantically updating their personal databases, while others were discreetly canceling challenges they had been considering issuing. Zeth'kar, from his position on a medical stretcher, managed to croak out a question that had been bothering him since consciousness returned. "How?" he wheezed, each word clearly costing him considerable effort. "You're so small. So fragile." Kai picked up her textbook and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Small, yes," she agreed. "But fragile? Humans evolved on a world where everything, the weather, the geology, the biology, even the plants, was actively trying to kill us. We got good at not dying. Really, really good." She paused, flipping through her textbook to find her place. "Also, I was holding back. Our instructors always told us to be careful with non-humans. Something about maintaining positive diplomatic relations and not accidentally starting wars. You know how it is." The implications of this statement rippled through the crowd like a shockwave through subspace. If this was Kai holding back, what would an actual human warrior be capable of? The question hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance, dangerous and fascinating in equal measure. As the medical team wheeled Zeth'kar away to the healing chambers, where he would spend the next several days contemplating the difference between theoretical superiority and practical reality, the arena slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Beings who had gathered to witness a primitive's humiliation instead found themselves discussing the philosophical implications of evolutionary pressure and the dangers of assumptions. Kai, Oblivious to the minor revolution she had sparked in galactic anthropology, settled back onto her bench and reopened her textbook. She had an exam on quantum field theory next week, and compared to that, breaking a few ribs was barely worth noting in her daily schedule. The betting pools, meanwhile, were undergoing rapid recalibration. The odds on any future challenges involving humans had shifted dramatically, and several entrepreneurial beings were already developing new markets around the concept of educational experiences with Deathworld species. Within hours, news of the incident had spread throughout the station's social networks with the speed of gossip and the embellishment typical of beings who enjoyed a good story more than strict adherence to facts. By the next day, Kai had supposedly defeated 12 opponents simultaneously while reciting poetry and solving mathematical equations. By the end of the week, the story had evolved to include laser vision and the ability to punch through bulkheads. Kai, when informed of her growing legend, merely shrugged and returned to her studies. She had more important things to worry about than reputation management. Her quantum mechanics professor was notoriously strict about deadlines, and disappointing an educator was far more terrifying than breaking a few crystalline bones. The real change, however, was subtler and more significant than any wild story or betting pool revision. The casual dismissal of humans as primitive weaklings began to give way to a more nuanced understanding of what evolution on a death world actually meant. Beings who had previously seen Earth's inhabitants as amusing curiosities started asking more pointed questions about human capabilities, training methods, and the exact definition of basic education. The answers, when they came, were enlightening in the way that revelation tended to be: sudden, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore once acknowledged. What humans called elementary physical education included training that would qualify as advanced combat preparation on most civilized worlds. What they considered normal childhood activities involved surviving conditions that would challenge seasoned explorers. What they described as basic safety knowledge encompassed skills that military units spent years mastering. And Kai, with her quiet demeanor and academic focus, represented not the peak of human physical achievement, but rather its baseline, the minimum standard that every member of her species was expected to meet before they were considered ready to interact with the wider galaxy. This realization spread through the station's population like a slow-acting virus, infecting conversations and coloring interactions with a new understanding of what it meant to be human. The Deathworld designation, previously dismissed as galactic bureaucracy's tendency toward melodrama, began to carry weight proportional to its implications. Zeth'kar, when he finally emerged from the medical bay with his ribs properly healed and his pride still tender, found himself the reluctant center of attention. Beings wanted to know what it felt like to be struck by a human, how the experience compared to their expectations, and whether the rumors about human strength were actually understated rather than exaggerated. His answers, delivered with the careful precision of someone who had learned to choose his words wisely, painted a picture that was both humbling and terrifying. Yes, the strike had been faster than his enhanced reflexes could track. Yes, the force had been sufficient to shatter a crystalline bone that could normally deflect plasma bolts. And yes, the human had been holding back, significantly. The final revelation came when someone asked about Kai's emotional state during the combat. Had she been angry? Frightened? Excited by the violence? Zeth'kar's answer was perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire experience. She was bored, he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had stared into an abyss and found it mildly disinterested in return. The whole time, she looked bored, like she was waiting for something interesting to happen. And there, in that simple observation, lay the true terror of humanity's place in the galaxy. They weren't savage warriors who reveled in combat or desperate survivors clinging to life through violence. They were beings so thoroughly adapted to deadly circumstances that breaking the bones of supposedly superior species barely registered as noteworthy. The galaxy, it seemed, had been making assumptions based on appearance rather than substance, a mistake that countless species throughout history had made when encountering humans. The only difference was that previous encounters had typically ended with entire civilizations learning the lesson the hard way. The Nexus Station, however, had been fortunate enough to receive its education through a single broken rib and a quiet physics student who just wanted to finish her homework in peace. It was, by human standards, a remarkably gentle introduction to the realities of Deathworld evolution. As Kai Chen turned another page in her textbook, blissfully unaware that she had single-handedly revised the galaxy's understanding of human capabilities, the universe continued its ancient dance of assumption and revelation. Somewhere in the medical bay, Zeth'kar was learning to breathe without wincing. Somewhere in the betting pools, odds were being recalculated. And somewhere in the vast expanse of space, other beings were having conversations about the strange, small creatures from the blue planet who smiled politely while casually redefining the possible. The lesson, as lessons often did, would spread beyond the confines of the station. But that was a story for another day, involving other beings who would learn the same fundamental truth that Zeth'kar had discovered through the educational medium of fractured ribs. When dealing with humans, appearances were not just deceiving, they were potentially hazardous to your health. For now, though, the Nexus station hummed with its usual activity, slightly wiser and considerably more careful about whom they chose to mock. Progress, after all, came in many forms, and sometimes it arrived wearing a simple jumpsuit and carrying a quantum mechanics textbook.